Sometimes the deepest bonds aren't with people, but with places that hold our secrets. For 30 years, Sarah Bennett made the same journey to a twisted oak tree deep in the Montana wilderness, drawn by something she couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. The tree wasn't ordinary. Its trunk bulged at the base, like it was hiding something inside, growing larger each year. The folks in Pine Ridge thought Sarah was wasting her life, visiting that same spot season after season with her old bedroll and notebook. They didn't understand why a woman would spend decades watching a tree, but Sarah felt something they couldn't. Every time she approached the clearing, the air seemed to change. The tree seemed to breathe. She documented every crack, every marking, every strange sound that came from within the swollen wood. After 3 decades of patient watching, Sarah finally placed her hand on the bark and heard something that would change her life forever. What had been growing inside that tree all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Pine Ridge as Sarah Bennett packed her familiar canvas bag with the same methodical care she'd practiced for 3 decades. At 58, her movements carried the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to waste neither motion nor time. The leather journal, its pages yellowed and edges worn smooth from countless handling, went in first, followed by her grandfather's old compass, a thermos of coffee that would stay warm until evening, and the faded bedroll that had accompanied her on every single journey to the tree. Sarah's cabin sat on the edge of town, where the last paved road gave way to dirt trails that wound into the Bitterroot Mountains. She'd bought the modest 2-bedroom house 20 years ago with her pension from the Forest Service, choosing it specifically for its proximity to the wilderness that had become her life's work. The walls were lined with topographical maps, marked in different colored inks, each color representing a different year of observations. Red for the first decade, blue for the second, green for the most recent 10 years. The progression told a story that only Sarah could read, a story of steady, inexplicable growth. The kitchen table served as her laboratory. Magnifying glasses of various strengths lay scattered alongside rulers, calipers, and a collection of colored pencils she used for detailed sketching. A digital camera, one of her few concessions to modern technology, sat beside stacks of photographs, arranged chronologically. The images showed the same tree from dozens of angles, documenting changes so gradual that they might have been imperceptible to a casual observer. But Sarah was anything but casual in her observations. She had first encountered the tree during her 2nd year as a forest ranger, when she was 28 and still believed that nature held no mysteries that science couldn't eventually explain. It was late September, and she'd been conducting a routine survey of the backcountry trails when she stumbled into the clearing. The meadow stretched perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, but dominated by a single oak tree that seemed impossibly out of place in the mountain ecosystem. Even then, the tree's base had been swollen, though nothing like what it had become over the ensuing decades. The trunk measured roughly 8 feet in diameter at its widest point, with bark that appeared almost smooth in places, as if something beneath was pressing outward against the wood. Sarah had made careful notes that first day, measuring and photographing what she assumed was simply an unusual growth pattern. She'd planned to mention it to the district botanist when she returned to headquarters, but something had drawn her back the following week. Then the week after that. By the end of her first season observing the tree, Sarah had filled an entire notebook with measurements, sketches, and observations that documented subtle changes no one else seemed to notice or care about. Dr. Emily Chen arrived in Sarah's life during the 5th year of her vigil. A geologist from the University of Montana, Emily had come to Pine Ridge to study the area's unique mineral formations. She and Sarah met at Hartwell's General Store, where Emily was asking about local geological anomalies. Tom Hartwell, the store's proprietor and Pine Ridge's unofficial information center, had immediately pointed her towards Sarah. "If there's anything strange happening in these mountains," Tom had said, with his characteristic grin, "Sarah Bennett's your woman. She knows every rock, tree, and creek within a 50-mile radius." Emily turned out to be everything Sarah appreciated in a person: curious, methodical, and refreshingly free of the skepticism that most people displayed when Sarah mentioned her tree. At 45, Emily had the kind of scientific mind that remained open to possibilities while demanding evidence. She'd accompanied Sarah on several trips to the clearing, bringing equipment that measured soil composition, electromagnetic fields, and seismic activity. The readings were always slightly anomalous, though never dramatically so. Enough to intrigue Emily, but not enough to warrant a formal study. Father Miguel Santos had entered Sarah's circle of confidants more recently, drawn by stories of the strange woman who spent her retirement visiting a tree. At 62, the parish priest possessed a quiet wisdom that came from decades of listening to people's deepest concerns. He'd sought Sarah out after hearing parishioners discuss her peculiar hobby with the mixture of affection and bewilderment that small town residents reserved for their more eccentric neighbors. "I've always believed," Father Miguel had told her during their first conversation, "that faith and mystery often occupy the same space. Perhaps what you're experiencing is something that doesn't require scientific explanation." Tom Hartwell, now in his early 70s, had known Sarah since her ranger days. His general store served as Pine Ridge's de facto community center, and Tom possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local history and personalities. He'd grown fond of Sarah over the years, appreciating her dedication even if he didn't understand its object. Whenever she needed supplies for her wilderness trips, Tom made sure she had everything necessary, often including items she hadn't thought to request. "That woman's got more determination than a bloodhound on a scent," he'd tell customers who asked about Sarah's regular purchases of camping gear and surveying equipment. "Been tracking something in those mountains for longer than most people stick with anything." The townspeople of Pine Ridge had long since accepted Sarah's eccentricity as part of the local landscape. Children grew up knowing about the tree lady who disappeared into the forest with mathematical precision every few weeks. Some residents had hiked out to see the famous tree for themselves, though most found it disappointingly ordinary. They couldn't see what Sarah saw, couldn't feel what she felt in that clearing where the meadow met the ancient forest. Sarah's cabin reflected 3 decades of accumulated knowledge. File cabinets contained weather records correlated with growth measurements. Bookshelves held volumes on dendrology, soil science, and forest ecology, their margins filled with Sarah's careful annotations. A corkboard displayed her latest photographs of the tree, red pins marking areas where she'd noticed recent changes, but it was the grandfather's prospecting map that occupied the place of honor above her fireplace. The hand-drawn chart dated to the 1890s, when old Henrik Bennett had searched these mountains for gold and silver. The map showed mineral claims and geological features, but it also contained symbols that Henrik had never explained to his family. Strange markings clustered around the area where Sarah's tree now stood, symbols that seemed to suggest significance beyond mere geological interest. Henrik Bennett had been a man of few words and many secrets. He'd brought his young family west during the mining boom, drawn by stories of fortunes waiting in Montana's mountains. Unlike many prospectors, Henrik had approached his work with scientific method, keeping detailed records and maps that survived long after his death. Sarah had inherited his papers along with his compass, and studying them had revealed her grandfather's particular interest in the area around what would become her tree. As Sarah prepared for what she sensed might be a significant visit to the clearing, she found herself thinking more than usual about Henrik's legacy. Something in his careful documentation suggested that he'd known about the tree, had perhaps even expected it to become important to future generations of his family. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. Comfort in feeling connected to family history, unease at the suggestion that her 30-year vigil might have been predetermined. The digital clock on her kitchen stove read 5:47 a.m. as Sarah shouldered her pack and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. The familiar weight of her equipment felt reassuring, each item serving a purpose refined by decades of practice. She'd walk the 7 miles to the trailhead, then hike another 4 miles through increasingly dense forest to reach the clearing. By the time she arrived, the morning sun would be filtering through the canopy, illuminating the tree in the golden light that always made her think of cathedral windows. Pine Ridge slept around her as she walked through town, her footsteps echoing softly on the empty streets. Most residents wouldn't stir for another hour or two, but Sarah had always preferred the quiet hours when the world belonged to those willing to claim it. She passed Tom's store, Father Miguel's church, and the handful of houses that constituted Pine Ridge's residential district. Each building held people who knew her story, who had watched her pursue her mysterious purpose with the patience of someone following a calling rather than a hobby. The dirt road leading to the mountains stretched ahead, disappearing into shadows that would soon give way to daylight. Sarah adjusted her pack straps and settled into the steady rhythm that had carried her on this journey hundreds of times before. Today felt different somehow, charged with a significance she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. After 30 years of patient observation, she sensed that her vigil was approaching some kind of culmination. The tree was waiting, as it always waited, growing and changing in ways that defied easy explanation. Sarah Bennett walked toward her destiny, carrying 3 decades of questions and the growing certainty that answers were finally within reach. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping down from the mountain peaks with an intensity that caught even Sarah's experienced weather sense off guard. She'd hiked through the morning under clear skies, reaching the familiar clearing just as the first clouds began gathering overhead. By the time she'd set up her equipment and begun her initial observations, the wind had picked up enough to set the surrounding forest into agitated motion, but the tree stood perfectly still. Sarah had observed this phenomenon before, though never quite so dramatically. While the Douglas firs and lodgepole pines around the clearing swayed and creaked in the mounting wind, the oak remained motionless, as if it existed in a pocket of calm air. The effect was unsettling, creating an island of unnatural quiet in the center of increasing turbulence. Thunder rumbled overhead as Sarah approached the tree with her measuring tape. The swollen base seemed more pronounced than ever, the bark stretched tight over whatever continued to grow within. She documented steady expansion over the years, but the change she observed now struck her as qualitatively different. The surface showed patterns she'd never noticed before, faint lines that resembled veins, creating a network of slightly raised ridges beneath the bark. As she knelt to take measurements, Sarah became aware of a sound that seemed to come from within the tree itself. It was barely audible above the storm, a rhythmic pulsing that reminded her of a heartbeat. She pressed her ear against the bark, and the sound became unmistakable. Something inside the tree was beating with slow, steady rhythm, like the pulse of some enormous sleeping creature. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing in stark white light. In that brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw the tree's surface ripple, as if the bark were no more substantial than water. When normal light returned, everything appeared solid again. But the heartbeat sound had grown stronger. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she recorded the new observations in her leather journal. 30 years of careful documentation had prepared her for gradual change, but nothing had prepared her for this. The tree was behaving like a living thing, not just alive in the way all trees were alive, but conscious, aware, responsive to her presence. Another flash of lightning, and this time Sarah was certain she saw movement beneath the bark. The veined patterns pulsed with the rhythm of the heartbeat, growing brighter for an instant before fading back to normal. She reached out instinctively, her palm pressing against the trunk where the pulsing seemed strongest. The moment her skin made contact with the bark, everything changed. Warmth flooded through Sarah's hand and up her arm, a sensation so intense and immediate that she gasped aloud. But she didn't pull away. The warmth felt welcoming, familiar somehow, like the touch of a friend she'd forgotten she had. The heartbeat sound grew louder, and she realized it was synchronizing with her own pulse, the tree somehow matching its rhythm to hers. Then, without any warning, a section of bark simply crumbled away beneath her touch. Sarah jerked her hand back and stared in amazement as pieces of ancient bark fell to the ground, revealing a hollow chamber within the trunk. The cavity was perhaps 6 inches wide and perfectly circular, its interior walls smooth as if carved by skilled hands. And nestled within that hollow space, glowing with its own soft light, was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. The wooden heart was exactly that, a perfect anatomical replica of a human heart, carved from wood that matched the tree's own grain. But unlike ordinary wood, this heart possessed a warmth and vitality that made it seem almost alive. As Sarah watched in wonder, it pulsed gently with the same rhythm she'd been hearing, each beat causing it to glow slightly brighter. With reverent care, Sarah reached into the hollow and lifted the wooden heart. It was surprisingly light, despite its apparent solidity, and warm to the touch in a way that seemed to emanate from within. As her fingers closed around it, she felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it made her dizzy. This object belonged to her, had always belonged to her, in some way she couldn't begin to understand. The heart's surface was intricately detailed, every ventricle and artery rendered with anatomical precision, but carved into its base, in letters so small they were barely visible, was an inscription in a script Sarah didn't recognize. The characters seemed to shift and flow as she studied them, as if they were alive and trying to communicate with her. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began to fall in heavy drops that somehow failed to reach the clearing. Sarah looked up to see the storm raging all around the meadow, while she remained in a bubble of perfect calm. The protection seemed to emanate from the tree itself, or perhaps from the wooden heart she now held. As the storm intensified around their sanctuary, Sarah carefully wrapped the heart in a soft cloth and placed it in her pack. The moment it left her hands, she felt a profound sense of loss, as if she'd been separated from a part of herself she hadn't known was missing. The tree's hollow had already begun to seal itself, bark flowing like liquid to close the opening. By the time the storm passed an hour later, no evidence remained of the dramatic event Sarah had witnessed. The tree stood as it always had, its swollen base showing no sign of the cavity that had held such treasure. But Sarah carried the wooden heart, and with it, the certain knowledge that her 30 years of patient watching had been leading to this moment. The hike back to Pine Ridge passed in a blur of overwhelming sensations. The wooden heart seemed to pulse in rhythm with her steps, its warmth radiating through her pack and into her back. More disturbing were the changes Sarah began to notice in her own perception. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct. She could hear individual birds calling from specific trees, could smell the mineral content of the creek water as she passed. Her senses had been sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. That night, sleep brought dreams unlike any Sarah had ever experienced. She found herself standing in the same clearing, but the forest around it was different, older, wilder, populated by trees that dwarfed even the ancient giants she knew. Native American voices called her name, though she couldn't see their owners. The wooden heart glowed in her hands, and she understood somehow that it was trying to tell her something crucial. She woke before dawn, with tears on her face, and a single word echoing in her mind. Guardian. Sarah returned to the tree the next morning, driven by a compulsion she couldn't resist. She needed to understand what had happened, to make sense of the changes she felt occurring within herself. But when she reached the clearing, she found the tree exactly as it had always been. The bark showed no sign of yesterday's opening, no evidence that anything extraordinary had occurred, yet everything had changed. Sarah could feel the tree's presence in a way she never had before, could sense its ancient patience and profound purpose. The wooden heart in her pack pulsed steadily, a constant reminder that she'd crossed some invisible threshold from which there could be no return. Standing in the morning light with the wooden heart warm against her chest, Sarah Bennett realized that her 30 years of faithful observation had been preparation for something far greater than she'd ever imagined. The tree had chosen her, marked her, changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her quiet life as Pine Ridge's eccentric tree watcher was over. Whatever came next would demand everything she had to give. The Pine Ridge Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its rooms filled with the accumulated memories of a community that had learned to preserve its past. Sarah climbed the front steps with the wooden heart secured in her jacket pocket, its steady warmth a constant reminder of how drastically her world had changed. She'd spent a sleepless night researching the inscription carved into the heart's base. But her own references had yielded nothing useful. Dorothy Walsh looked up from her desk as Sarah entered, her weathered face brightening with genuine pleasure. At 73, Dorothy had served as the Historical Society's volunteer librarian for over 2 decades, her mind a repository of local knowledge that supplemented the official records. She knew every family's history, every significant event that had shaped Pine Ridge's character. "Sarah, what brings you here so early?" Dorothy's voice carried the warm curiosity of someone who had learned to find fascination in unexpected places. "Don't tell me you've finally decided to research your grandfather's mining claims." "Actually, that's exactly what I'm here for," Sarah replied, pulling out a careful sketch of the inscription. "I found something that might be connected to Henrik's work, but I need help with translation." Dorothy examined the sketch with practiced eyes, her expression growing more intrigued by the moment. "These symbols look familiar," she murmured, reaching for a thick folder marked Indigenous Records. "We have some materials from the Salish tribes who originally inhabited this area. Let me see what I can find." The folder contained photocopies of documents from various sources, anthropological studies, missionary records, and tribal oral histories that had been collected over the years. Dorothy spread several pages across her desk, comparing Sarah's sketch to the symbols in the historical records. "Here," Dorothy said, pointing to a page from a 1920s ethnographic study. "These symbols appear in several contexts, always associated with spiritual significance. According to this research, they relate to concepts of guardianship and sacred responsibility." Sarah leaned closer, her heart racing as she recognized elements of the inscription. "What exactly do they mean?" "The phrase roughly translates to guardian's gift," Dorothy explained, consulting additional notes. "It appears in stories about individuals chosen to protect sacred sites. The tribes believed certain locations held spiritual power that required constant vigilance to maintain balance between the physical and spirit worlds." The word sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the morning air. Guardian, the same word that had echoed through her dreams. "Are there other references to this area specifically?" Dorothy nodded, pulling out a map that had been hand-drawn by a tribal elder in the 1890s. This was created by Joseph Running Bear, one of the last traditional keepers of the old stories. "Look here." She pointed to a spot that corresponded exactly to Sarah's clearing. He marked this location with the same symbols, along with a note that translates roughly to "place where the heart sleeps." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her pocket, where the wooden heart pulsed gently against her ribs. "The heart sleeps?" According to the tribal stories, certain trees served as guardians themselves, protecting the community from spiritual threats. The heart represented the tree's essential power, its ability to maintain the barrier between worlds. Dorothy paused, studying Sarah's face. "This is more than academic interest, isn't it?" Before Sarah could answer, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room seemed to shimmer at the edges of her vision, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The wooden heart grew warmer, its pulsing rhythm accelerating until it matched her racing heartbeat. "Sarah, are you all right?" Dorothy's concerned voice seemed to come from very far away. The sensation passed as quickly as it had come, leaving Sarah disoriented but oddly energized. "I'm fine," she managed, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. Just tired from a long hike yesterday, but the episode had been too similar to her dreams to dismiss as simple fatigue. Something was happening to her, something connected to the wooden heart and the tree that had guarded its secrets for so long. The inscription wasn't just words, it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of her role in something much larger than she'd ever imagined. Dorothy gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. "I can make copies of these for you," she offered. "And Sarah, if you found something significant out there, something that connects to these old stories, you should be careful." The tribes took this kind of responsibility very seriously. Sarah thanked Dorothy and left the Historical Society with copies of the tribal records tucked safely in her pack. But her research had raised more questions than it answered. As she walked home, she became increasingly aware of subtle changes in her perception. She could hear conversations from blocks away, could smell the distinct mineral content of different water sources, could sense the emotional states of people she passed on the street. The changes intensified throughout the day. By evening, Sarah found herself able to distinguish between different types of wood by scent alone, could tell the age and health of trees simply by touching their bark. When she watered her small garden, she could feel the plant's gratitude as a warm glow in her chest. That night brought dreams more vivid and specific than before. She stood again in the clearing, but now she wasn't alone. A woman who shared her features but wore traditional native dress stood beside the tree, her hand resting on its trunk with casual familiarity. The woman spoke without moving her lips, her voice echoing directly in Sarah's mind. "The awakening has begun, granddaughter. You carry the blood of guardians, the inheritance we thought was lost." "I don't understand," Sarah replied, her dream voice steady despite her confusion. "Your great-great-grandmother. Running Deer was the last of our line to serve the tree. When the settlers came, she hid the heart and broke the guardian chain to protect our secrets. But the tree remembered. It waited for one of her blood to return. Why me? Why now?" The woman's expression grew grave. "Because the binding weakens. The thing that sleeps beneath the roots stirs again. Without a guardian, it will wake, and the balance will be lost." Sarah jolted awake, her heart pounding and her body covered in cold sweat. But the wooden heart in her bedside drawer pulsed with reassuring warmth, confirming that her dreams were more than mere imagination. She was connected to something ancient and important, something that demanded her attention, whether she felt ready or not. The next morning brought Dr. Emily Chen to Pine Ridge, responding to Sarah's urgent phone call. Emily arrived with a van full of geological equipment, her scientific curiosity piqued by Sarah's cryptic description of unusual readings at the tree site. "I've been thinking about our previous measurements," Emily explained as they loaded her gear. "The magnetic anomalies we detected were consistent, but I never did a full spectrum analysis. If something significant is happening, we should be able to document it." They hiked to the clearing in comfortable silence, but Sarah could feel Emily's sideways glances. Her friend was noting the same changes that Sarah was still trying to understand. The increased alertness, the way Sarah seemed to know exactly where to step without looking, the unconscious confidence with which she navigated the forest. When they reached the tree, Emily's instruments immediately detected readings that made her pause and recalibrate. "Sarah, this is extraordinary. The electromagnetic field is 3 times stronger than it was last month, and the pattern is completely different. It's almost as if what? As if something inside the tree is generating its own field, something that wasn't active before." Emily looked up from her equipment with wide eyes. "What exactly did you find here?" Sarah made the decision to spend the entire night beside the tree, driven by instincts she was still learning to trust. Emily had returned to town with her puzzling readings, promising to analyze the data and return with additional equipment. But Sarah couldn't leave. Something in the wooden heart's increasingly urgent pulsing told her that patience was no longer an option. She set up her camp in the same spot where she'd maintained her vigil for 30 years. But everything felt different now. The familiar rituals of unrolling her bedding and organizing her supplies took on ceremonial significance. as if she were preparing for something far more important than simple observation. As twilight deepened into full darkness, the tree began to sing. The sound started so quietly that Sarah almost missed it beneath the normal forest noises, a low, harmonic vibration that seemed to emanate from the trunk itself. Gradually, the tone grew stronger and more complex, developing into a deep chord that resonated through the ground and up into her bones. The wooden heart in her pocket pulsed in perfect synchronization with the tree's song, creating a rhythm that felt ancient and purposeful. Sarah found herself drawn to walk around the tree's circumference, her steps unconsciously matching the harmonic patterns. With each circuit, the song grew louder and more intricate, layering melodies that seemed to call to something deep within her genetic memory. By the time she completed her fifth circle, she understood that the tree was trying to communicate, to share knowledge that couldn't be expressed in words. Following an impulse she didn't fully understand, Sarah knelt at the base of the tree and began digging with her bare hands. The soil felt warm and loose, yielding easily to her searching fingers. 6 inches down, her fingertips encountered something smooth and hard, a hollow bone that seemed to have been waiting for her to find it. The bone flute emerged from the earth with an almost audible sigh, as if the ground itself was relieved to release its burden. The instrument was perhaps 18 inches long, carved from what appeared to be the leg bone of some large animal. Its surface bore intricate patterns that matched the symbols Sarah had seen in the tribal records. Spiraling designs that seemed to move in the moonlight. Without conscious thought, Sarah lifted the flute to her lips and blew a soft note. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The tree's song exploded into full voice, a symphony of harmonics that filled the clearing, with music unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. But more startling was the effect on the surrounding forest. Animals emerged from the darkness as if summoned, deer, rabbits, even a family of black bears that approached without fear or aggression. Birds that should have been sleeping began to sing, their voices blending with the tree's ancient melody. Sarah continued to play, though she had no memory of learning the tune that flowed from the flute. Her fingers found positions on their own, creating melodies that felt both familiar and impossibly old. With each note, her connection to the tree deepened, and with it came visions that made her previous dreams seem pale by comparison. She saw the clearing as it had been centuries ago, when Running Deer had stood in this same spot, playing this same flute. But Running Deer wasn't alone. She was surrounded by members of her tribe, all participating in a ritual that maintained the delicate balance between worlds. The tree had been smaller then, but its purpose was the same, to serve as a guardian, a living barrier that prevented ancient evils from breaking free. The visions shifted, showing Sarah glimpses of Running Deer's life. She watched her great-great-grandmother receive training from elders, learning the songs and rituals that kept the guardian tree strong. She saw the sorrow in Running Deer's eyes as white settlers arrived, bringing changes that would make the old ways impossible to maintain. Most painfully, she witnessed Running Deer's desperate decision to hide the wooden heart and break the guardian lineage, hoping that her sacrifice would keep the tree's secrets safe until someone worthy could claim them again. "You have returned to us, her granddaughter." Running Deer's voice spoke directly into Sarah's mind, warm with joy and relief. "The blood remembers, even after all these years." "I don't know how to do this," Sarah replied without stopping her playing. "I don't know how to be what you need me to be. The flute will teach you as it taught me. The tree will guide you, as it has guided our people for generations beyond counting. But first, you must choose to accept what you are. What am I? The last guardian of this sacred place, the final barrier between the sleeping darkness and the world above." As Running Deer's spirit faded from the vision, Sarah became aware of Emily Chen, approaching through the forest, drawn by the otherworldly music. Behind Emily walked Father Miguel Santos, his face filled with wonder and concern. Both had been awakened by dreams that called them to the clearing, though neither fully understood why. "Sarah," Emily called softly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening, but unable to stay away. "Are you all right?" Sarah lowered the flute, and the tree's song gradually faded to its previous whisper. The assembled animals melted back into the forest with the same quiet dignity with which they had arrived. But the sense of connection remained, as if invisible threads now linked Sarah to every living thing within miles of the clearing. "I'm changing," Sarah said simply, looking at her two friends with eyes that held depths they'd never noticed before. "Something that was sleeping in my blood has awakened, and I don't think there's any going back." Father Miguel stepped forward, his priest's training, telling him that he was witnessing something sacred. "What is this place, Sarah? What have you found here?" "Not found," Sarah corrected, rising to her feet with the bone flute still warm in her hands. "Inherited. This tree has been waiting for me my entire life, waiting for someone with the right bloodline to reclaim a responsibility that was set aside long ago." Emily's scientific instruments had gone completely haywire, their displays showing readings that defied conventional explanation. "Sarah, the electromagnetic patterns here are unlike anything in the literature. It's as if the tree is generating its own field, one that's affecting everything around it." "Not just affecting," Sarah said quietly, watching the two women who had become her closest friends. "Protecting. This tree stands guard over something that must never be allowed to wake." She looked up at the ancient oak, its branches reaching toward stars that seemed unusually bright in the clearing's perfect circle of sky. Tomorrow would bring decisions she wasn't ready to make, challenges she wasn't trained to meet. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years of watching and waiting, Sarah Bennett finally understood her true purpose. The Guardian's daughter had come home. The copper binding cuff appeared on the tree 3 days after Sarah's night with the bone flute, emerging from the bark like a metal flower blooming in slow motion. She discovered it during her morning visit, the ancient metal gleaming despite its obvious age, as if the tree had been polishing it from within for decades. Sarah approached the artifact with reverence, understanding instinctively that this moment marked another threshold in her transformation. The cuff was perhaps 4 inches wide, made of copper that had been worked into intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow as she watched. Symbols covered its surface, some matching those in the tribal records, others unlike anything she'd ever seen. The moment she slipped the cuff onto her left wrist, the world exploded into new dimensions of perception. Sarah gasped as layers of reality peeled away, revealing the true nature of the clearing. The tree stood before her in its spiritual form, a towering column of pure light that extended both deep into the earth and high into the sky. But wrapped around that pillar of radiance was something else, something dark and hungry that pulsed with malevolent purpose. The entity within the tree was vast, far larger than Sarah had imagined. It pressed against the boundaries of its wooden prison like a caged beast, testing the strength of its bars. She could feel its awareness as it noticed her presence, could sense the cold intelligence that had been planning and scheming through centuries of enforced sleep. "So," a voice whispered directly into her mind, cold and amused, "another guardian awakens. How delicious. It has been so long since I had someone new to corrupt." Sarah stepped back involuntarily, but the copper cuff anchored her perception in the spiritual realm. She could see the entity clearly now, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that had been feeding on the life force of the mountain itself, growing stronger with each passing year. "What are you?" she demanded, though she wasn't certain she spoke aloud. "I am what your ancestors feared to name," the entity replied, its voice like ice scraping against stone. "I am the darkness that waits beneath all growing things, the hunger that devours light and hope and life itself. Your little tree has kept me contained for so long, but the bindings weaken. Soon I will be free to reclaim what was stolen from me." Through the copper cuff's enhanced perception, Sarah could see the truth of the tree's purpose. It wasn't just a guardian. It was a living prison, its massive root system forming an intricate cage around the entity's true form. The wooden heart had been the key that maintained the binding, and her family had served as its keepers through generations of faithful service. But running deer's desperate decision to hide the heart and break the guardian lineage had consequences that were only now becoming apparent. Without a guardian to perform the necessary rituals, to channel spiritual energy through the bone flute and maintain the tree's strength, the ancient bindings had been slowly deteriorating. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the entity continued, its voice growing stronger. "I have had decades to plant my influence in the soil, the water, the very air of this mountain. Your people already carry traces of my touch, though they do not know it yet." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Through the cuff's enhanced perception, she could see dark tendrils extending from the tree's roots, spreading through the underground water system that fed Pine Ridge's wells. The entity had been slowly poisoning her community, preparing them for the day when it would break free. "Running deer!" Sarah called out, hoping her ancestor's spirit could hear her. "I need your guidance." The response came immediately, Running Deer's presence manifesting as a warm, golden light that stood in stark contrast to the entity's darkness. "You see truly now, granddaughter. The binding circle was broken when I hid the heart, but it can be restored. The old ways still have power, but only if you accept the full weight of guardianship." What does that mean? To be a guardian is to stand between worlds, to sacrifice your purely human existence for something greater. The copper cuff will anchor you to the spiritual realm, but it comes at a cost. You will see things others cannot see, feel the pain of every corrupted root, every poisoned stream. You will carry the burden of protecting your people from threats they will never understand. Sarah looked back toward Pine Ridge, her enhanced vision showing her the subtle signs of the entity's influence. The water in Tom Hartwell's store had a faint dark shimmer. Father Miguel's church showed stress fractures that went deeper than the physical structure. Even Emily's scientific equipment was being affected, its readings distorted by the growing spiritual contamination. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "The final binding will fail within the year," Running Deer replied. "But the corruption spreads faster now that you have awakened its attention. You must gather the 7 sacred crystals and restore the protection circle before the autumn equinox, or all will be lost." The vision faded, leaving Sarah standing alone in the clearing with the copper cuff warm against her wrist. But she was no longer truly alone. She could feel the presence of every living thing within miles, from the smallest insects to the largest predators. More disturbing, she could also sense the entity's influence spreading like a slow poison through the mountain's ecosystem. Birds began falling from the sky 3 days later. Tom Hartwell was the first to notice, finding a dozen dead ravens scattered around his store's parking lot. Father Miguel discovered similar scenes around the church, while reports came in from throughout Pine Ridge of unusual animal deaths. The local veterinarian found no obvious cause. The animals simply appeared to have died of exhaustion, as if something had drained their life force. Sarah knew the truth. The entity was testing its growing power, reaching out beyond the tree's immediate vicinity to claim small victories. Each death fed its strength, weakened the barrier that kept it contained. Emily arrived with a van full of equipment, her scientific mind struggling to explain readings that defied conventional physics. "Sarah, the electromagnetic anomalies are spreading. Whatever's happening at your tree, it's affecting the entire valley now." "It's not my tree," Sarah corrected quietly. "I'm its guardian, not its owner. And what's happening is something that science alone can't understand or stop." She showed Emily and Father Miguel the copper cuff, explaining what her enhanced perception had revealed. The entity, the ancient bindings, the need to gather 7 sacred crystals before time ran out. All of it sounded impossible, but the evidence of supernatural forces was becoming undeniable. "These crystals?" Father Miguel asked, his priest's training helping him accept mysteries that science couldn't explain. "Where are they found?" "Running Deer will guide me to them," Sarah replied, watching a family of deer flee past the clearing in obvious panic. "But each one requires a test. a proof that I'm worthy to wield the Guardian's power. The first test came that very afternoon. Following the spiritual compass that the copper cuff provided, Sarah hiked to a cave system in the mountain's northern face. The entrance was nearly hidden by fallen rocks, but her enhanced senses could detect the crystal's presence within. The cave stretched deep into the mountain, its passages carved by underground streams that had long since found other routes. Sarah descended with only a flashlight and her growing spiritual awareness to guide her. The copper cuff grew warmer as she approached the crystal's location, while whispers in the darkness suggested that the entity's influence had reached even here. The first crystal waited in a chamber filled with ancient pictographs, its surface glowing with inner light that made Sarah's flashlight unnecessary. But between her and the crystal stood a challenge that Running Deer's spirit had prepared, a reflection of her own fears and doubts made manifest. The shadow Sarah spoke with her own voice, questioning every choice that had led to this moment. "You're 58 years old," it said. "You've lived a quiet, comfortable life. Why throw it away for the sake of people who think you're eccentric at best, crazy at worst?" "Because they're my people," Sarah replied, reaching for the crystal. "Because this is what I was born to do." The shadow dissolved at her touch, and the first crystal settled warm and bright into her palm. One down, 6 to go, but as Sarah emerged from the cave, she found Emily waiting with troubling news. Pine Ridge's water supply was showing signs of contamination that couldn't be explained by conventional testing. People were beginning to report strange dreams, unsettling thoughts that seemed to come from outside their own minds. The entity's influence was accelerating, and Sarah was running out of time. The crystal shard necklace began forming itself as Sarah collected each sacred stone, the individual pieces somehow knowing how to link together into a protective whole. Running Deer's spirit appeared more frequently now, guiding Sarah through the complex rituals required to obtain each crystal while teaching her the Guardian techniques that had been passed down through generations. The second crystal came from the summit of Eagle's Peak, requiring a dangerous climb during a thunderstorm, while the entity sent visions of failure and death to shake her resolve. Sarah faced the test with growing confidence, her connection to the spiritual realm allowing her to find handholds invisible to normal sight. The third crystal waited in the depths of Mirror Lake, protected by illusions that showed Sarah drowning in the dark water. But her enhanced perception revealed the truth. The lake was barely waist deep, and the crystal rested on a natural altar of smooth stones. With each trial, Sarah's abilities grew stronger, but so did the entity's efforts to stop her. The thing beneath the tree was fully awake now, no longer content to wait for the bindings to fail naturally. It began actively corrupting the mountain's ecosystem, turning healthy streams into vectors of spiritual poison. Emily provided crucial support, her scientific equipment helping to map the entity's influence, even though she couldn't fully understand what they were fighting. She set up monitoring stations throughout the valley, tracking electromagnetic anomalies and documenting changes in local wildlife behavior. "The pattern is expanding in a perfect spiral," Emily reported during one of their strategy sessions. "Whatever's driving this follows mathematical principles, even if the source isn't natural." Father Miguel offered different but equally valuable assistance. His theological training helped him understand the spiritual dimensions of Sarah's mission, while his connections throughout the community provided early warning of the entity's growing influence on Pine Ridge's residents. "Mrs. Henderson came to confession yesterday," he told Sarah quietly. "She spoke of dreams where a voice told her to poison the town's water supply. She's a good woman. She would never consider such a thing normally. But the voice was so persuasive," she said, "so reasonable in its arguments." The fourth crystal tested Sarah's wisdom, hidden within a maze of slot canyons where each wrong turn led deeper into confusion. She succeeded by learning to trust the copper cuff's guidance over her own logical thinking. allowing spiritual intuition to override decades of rational training. The fifth crystal demanded sacrifice, not of life, but of attachment. Sarah had to willingly give up her comfortable cabin, her carefully organized research, everything that had defined her identity for 30 years. She packed her few essential belongings and moved to a simple tent beside the guardian tree, fully committing to her role. But the entity's influence was spreading faster than Sarah could gather the crystals. Mayor Patricia Keene began holding town meetings to discuss the growing crisis of dangerous wildlife behavior and water contamination. Without mentioning Sarah by name, she managed to imply that the problems were connected to unauthorized activities in the protected forest areas. "We need to take action to protect our community," Mayor Keene declared to a packed town hall. "These unexplained phenomena threaten our way of life, our economic stability, and our children's safety." Sarah attended the meeting, sitting in the back row while angry residents demanded explanations for the increasingly bizarre events plaguing their town. She could see the dark influence radiating from several people, including Mayor Keene herself. The entity was building a base of human support, preparing for the moment when it would no longer need to hide its presence. Tom Hartwell stood up during the public comment period, his weathered face showing the strain of recent events. "Now hold on, Patricia. Sarah Bennett has been protecting these mountains longer than some of you have lived here. If there's something wrong, she's more likely to help fix it than cause it." "With respect, Tom," Mayor Keene replied smoothly, "Miss Bennett's hobby has become an obsession that may be contributing to our problems. Perhaps it's time for professional intervention." The words carried undertones that made Sarah's enhanced senses recoil. The entity was working through Mayor Keene, turning the community against its only protection. Sarah slipped out of the meeting before the discussion could escalate further. But she'd seen enough to understand the growing danger. Dorothy Walsh found Sarah at her tent the next morning, bringing coffee and a worried expression. "The Historical Society voted last night to revoke your research privileges," she said apologetically. "Patricia convinced them that your activities might be disturbing important archaeological sites." "It's not really about the research," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The entity is isolating me, turning people against me so I'll have no support when the final confrontation comes." "Entity?" Dorothy's voice showed more curiosity than disbelief. "Sarah, what exactly are you fighting out here?" Sarah decided the time for secrecy had passed. She showed Dorothy the copper cuff, explained about the guardian lineage and the ancient prison beneath the tree. Dorothy listened with the same open-minded attention she brought to all historical research, asking practical questions about timelines and spiritual mechanics. "So you need 7 crystals total?" Dorothy asked. "And you have 5? "The 6th is the most dangerous yet," Sarah admitted. "Running Deer showed me its location, inside the abandoned Copper Creek mine, the mine that collapsed and killed 6 men in 1982, including your grandfather." Dorothy said quietly. Sarah nodded, finally understanding the full scope of her family's sacrifice. "Henrik didn't die in a mining accident. He went into that mine to retrieve the 6th crystal, knowing it would cost him his life. He died protecting the guardian lineage, making sure the crystal would be available when I was ready to claim it." The revelation added urgency to Sarah's mission. Her grandfather had sacrificed everything to ensure she would have the tools needed to succeed. She couldn't let his death be meaningless. The 6th crystal waited in the deepest part of the collapsed mine, accessible only through a narrow passage that had been sealed since the day Henrik Bennett died. Sarah descended into darkness with only the copper cuff's guidance, following spiritual traces that led through unstable rock and treacherous drops. The entity's presence was strongest here, in the deep places where sunlight had never reached. It whispered constantly as Sarah climbed down through the ruins of her grandfather's final mission, offering her easy alternatives, and promising to spare Pine Ridge if she would only abandon her quest. "Your grandfather's bones lie ahead," the voice hissed. Join him in the darkness, and I will find another way to freedom, one that spares your precious town." But Sarah pressed forward, guided by Henrik's spirit and her own growing determination. The sixth crystal blazed with light when she finally reached it, dispelling the darkness that had claimed her grandfather's life. As she lifted the stone, she felt Henrik's presence one final time, proud, loving, and infinitely relieved that his sacrifice had not been in vain. 5 crystals down, 2 to go. But time was running out, and the final crystal waited in the most dangerous place of all, directly beneath the guardian tree. In the chamber where the entity's true form lay bound by weakening chains of light and earth, the memory stone revealed itself when Sarah touched the 6th crystal, emerging from the mine wall like a teardrop of polished granite. The moment her fingers made contact with its smooth surface, the world around her dissolved into a flood of preserved consciousness that belonged to her grandfather. Henrik Bennett's memories crashed over Sarah with the force of a mountain avalanche. She experienced his life as if it were her own. His arrival in Montana as a young prospector, his discovery of the guardian tree, his growing understanding of the ancient responsibility that had fallen to his family line. But the most shocking revelation was that Henrik had been fully aware of his role as guardian from the beginning. The prospecting, the mining claims, even his marriage to Sarah's grandmother, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to maintain the bloodline and protect the tree's secrets. "My dear granddaughter," Henrik's preserved voice spoke directly into her mind. "I have waited so long for you to find this memory. There is so much you need to understand. So much I could never tell you while you still had the chance to choose a different path." Through Henrik's memories, Sarah experienced the night running deer had come to him in vision, explaining the desperate plan to break the guardian lineage temporarily. "The white man's world will not understand our ways," Running Deer had told Henrik. "But the tree will remember, and when the time is right, it will call one of our blood back to service." Sarah watched through her grandfather's eyes as he made the terrible decision to hide the truth from his own son, Sarah's father. The guardian knowledge would skip a generation, preserved only in Henrik's memories and the artifacts he carefully positioned throughout the mountain. "Your father was a good man," Henrik's voice continued, "but he lacked the spiritual sensitivity needed for guardianship. I knew the calling would manifest in his daughter instead. Everything I did, every mine I dug, every map I drew, was preparation for your eventual awakening." The memories showed Sarah the true scope of the entity's corruption. It hadn't been passively waiting for the bindings to fail. For decades, it had been actively working to subvert the guardian lineage, influencing key people in Pine Ridge to ensure that when the time came, Sarah would face opposition from within her own community. Mayor Patricia Keene's corruption went back years, to when she first ran for office with unexplained financial backing. The entity had been grooming her as its primary human agent, gradually increasing its influence until she became nothing more than a puppet dancing to its will. But Henrik's most devastating revelation concerned the wooden heart itself. "The heart was never meant to be found by accident," his memory explained. "I programmed the tree to release it only when you were ready, only when the entity's growing power made further delay impossible. Your 30 years of faithful observation weren't preparation, they were the test itself." Sarah staggered under the weight of this knowledge. Every decision she'd made, every choice that had led her to this moment, had been guided by forces she hadn't understood. Her free will was an illusion. She'd been following a path laid out for her before she was born. "No!" Running Deer's spirit appeared beside Henrik's memory, her voice firm with contradiction. "The path was prepared, granddaughter, but the choice to walk it was always yours. Even now you could turn away, leave the mountain, let others deal with what comes next, and let the entity destroy everything I care about." Sarah's reply came without hesitation. "Yes," Running Deer said simply. "That choice remains available. Guardianship cannot be forced. It must be freely accepted, even when the alternatives are terrible. Through Henrik's preserved consciousness, Sarah experienced the night he'd entered the Copper Creek mine for the final time. He'd known he wouldn't survive the journey, known that retrieving the sixth crystal would require his life force to break through the entity's defenses. But he'd also known that without that crystal, Sarah would fail in her mission. "I died willingly." Henrik's voice carried no regret, only the deep satisfaction of duty fulfilled. "My death was not a tragedy, it was the completion of my purpose. Just as your acceptance of guardianship completes yours." The memory stone showed Sarah one final, crucial piece of information. The seventh and final crystal wasn't hidden in some distant location requiring dangerous tests. It lay directly beneath the guardian tree, in the chamber where the entity's true form writhed against its weakening bonds. But obtaining it would require Sarah to descend into that spiritual darkness and face the creature's full power without the protection of the binding circle. As Henrik's memories faded, Sarah found herself back in the collapsed mine, but she was no longer alone. Emily Chen's voice echoed from above, calling her name with obvious concern. "Sarah!" The electromagnetic readings just went completely chaotic. "Are you all right down there?" Sarah climbed toward the surface, the sixth crystal warm in her palm and Henrik's revelations burning in her mind. When she emerged into daylight, she found Emily and Father Miguel waiting with expressions of deep worry. "How long was I down there?" Sarah asked. 6 hours, Emily replied. "We were getting ready to call for rescue equipment." But Sarah's enhanced perception told her that more than time had passed. The entity's influence had grown dramatically while she was underground, spreading its corruption through Pine Ridge with alarming speed. She could see the dark tendrils reaching into every home, every business, every person in the community. "We need to get back to town immediately," Sarah said. "Something's happened while I was in the mine." They found Pine Ridge in chaos. Animals were fleeing the valley in mass exodus. Deer, bears, even domestic pets, abandoning their homes to escape the entity's growing power. The few remaining birds flew in disturbed patterns, their natural navigation completely disrupted. Mayor Keene had called an emergency town meeting, and as Sarah approached the community center, she could hear the mayor's voice amplified by a portable sound system. But when she listened with her enhanced senses, Sarah detected a second voice speaking in harmony with Keene's, a cold, ancient presence that was no longer bothering to hide its influence. "The time for half measures has passed," Mayor Keene was saying to the assembled crowd. "The source of our troubles is obvious to anyone willing to see the truth. Sarah Bennett and her obsessive activities have awakened something dangerous in our mountains. For the safety of our community, she must be stopped." Through the windows, Sarah could see the crowd's reaction. These were people she'd known for years, friends and neighbors who had always treated her with respect, despite her eccentricities. But their faces showed an unnatural anger, a hatred that had been planted and cultivated by supernatural influence. "They're going to try to arrest me," Sarah realized. Or worse, Father Miguel placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Then we need to move quickly. How many crystals do you have left to find?" "Just one," Sarah replied, looking toward the guardian tree visible in the distance. "But it's in the most dangerous place of all." The entity had been manipulating events for much longer than she'd realized, preparing for this moment when it would finally have enough power to break free. Time was running out, and Sarah's own community had become her enemy. The final confrontation was about to begin. The ancestor totem emerged from the guardian tree at sunset, its carved surface gleaming with spiritual power that made Sarah's enhanced senses sing with recognition. The staff stood nearly 6 feet tall, crafted from wood that matched the tree's own grain, but somehow felt older, more concentrated, as if centuries of guardian energy had been compressed into its form. Sarah approached the totem with reverence, understanding that this was the final tool she would need for the binding ritual. As her fingers closed around the smooth shaft, she felt the presence of every guardian who had ever served the tree, generations of protectors who had given their lives to maintain the barrier between worlds. The time of choosing has come. Running Deer's spirit manifested more clearly than ever before. her form solid enough to cast shadows in the fading light. Tonight, the entity will make its final attempt to break free. The autumn equinox provides the perfect alignment of spiritual forces. If the binding fails now, it will be decades before another opportunity arises. "Will I survive this?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Survival is not the question," Running Deer replied gently. "The question is whether you are prepared to become something more than human, to sacrifice your earthly existence for the greater good." The sound of vehicles approaching through the forest interrupted their conversation. Sarah turned to see a convoy of trucks and SUVs bouncing along the dirt road toward the clearing, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Mayor Keene had mobilized a significant portion of Pine Ridge's population, all of them corrupted by the entity's influence and convinced that Sarah posed a mortal threat to their community. Emily and Father Miguel appeared at Sarah's sides, both carrying equipment they hoped might help in the coming confrontation. Emily's scientific instruments were designed to detect and possibly disrupt electromagnetic anomalies, while Father Miguel had brought holy water, blessed salt, and other tools of spiritual warfare. "How many people are we facing?" Father Miguel asked, counting the approaching vehicles. "At least 40, Emily replied grimly. "And they're all under supernatural influence. How do we fight our own neighbors?" "We don't fight them," Sarah said, her voice carrying new authority as she gripped the ancestor totem. "We save them. The entity's hold on these people will break when its primary source of power is severed. But first, she had to retrieve the 7th crystal from the most dangerous location imaginable, the chamber beneath the tree where the entity's true form waited in its weakening prison. Sarah knelt at the base of the guardian tree and pressed her palm against its trunk. "Show me the way," she whispered, calling upon the connection that the copper cuff had established. The tree's response was immediate and overwhelming. The ground beneath her feet began to glow with soft light, revealing a spiral pattern that led directly to a hidden entrance among the massive roots. As Sarah watched, the earth itself seemed to part, creating a passage that descended into the tree's spiritual heart. "I have to go down there alone," she told her companions. "The entity will try to corrupt anyone who enters its domain. You need to stay here and protect the binding circle when I begin the ritual." "Sarah, wait," Emily called as the convoy of corrupted townspeople drew closer. "My instruments are showing massive energy buildups throughout the valley. Whatever that thing is preparing to do, it's happening soon." Through the copper cuff's enhanced perception, Sarah could see the truth of Emily's warning. The entity was drawing power from every corrupted person in Pine Ridge, every poisoned stream, every dying tree. It was gathering strength for one final assault on the bindings that had held it for so long. Mayor Keene's amplified voice echoed across the clearing as the convoy reached the tree line. "Sarah Bennett, you are under citizen's arrest for destruction of public property and endangering public safety. Surrender immediately!" But Sarah was already descending into the earth, following the spiral path toward the chamber where the 7th crystal waited. The ancestor totem glowed with increasing intensity as she moved deeper. Its light, the only thing standing between her and the absolute darkness that pressed in from all sides. The descent felt endless, though Sarah knew she was traveling as much through spiritual dimensions as physical space. The walls of the passage showed carved symbols from dozens of different cultures, guardian traditions from around the world, all connected by the same fundamental purpose of containing ancient evils. She emerged into a vast underground chamber that defied the laws of physics. The space stretched impossibly far in all directions, lit by the pulsing glow of spiritual energy that emanated from the chamber's center. And there, suspended in a cage of light and earth and pure will, was the entity's true form. Sarah had expected something monstrous, but the creature was worse than that. It was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, perfectly designed for its purpose of corruption and consumption. It appeared as a constantly shifting mass of shadow and starlight, its surface reflecting distorted images of every person it had ever influenced. "Welcome, little guardian," the entity spoke directly into her mind, its voice like honey poured over broken glass. "I have been waiting so long to meet you properly." The seventh crystal hung suspended above the entity's cage, blazing with light that hurt to look at directly. But between Sarah and her goal stretched a gauntlet of spiritual traps and psychological warfare that would test every aspect of her newfound abilities. "You know this is futile," the entity continued as Sarah began to approach. "Even if you manage to complete the binding ritual, it will only delay the inevitable. I'm patient. I can wait another century, another millennium. But you are mortal, and your descendants will eventually forget the old ways." Sarah pressed forward, the ancestor totem cutting through the entity's illusions like a sword through smoke. "My ancestors managed to contain you for thousands of years. I only need to do it once." "Ah, but your ancestors had communities of believers, entire tribes dedicated to maintaining the balance. You have what? 2 friends and a priest? How long do you think your little circle will last without you?" The entity's words struck at Sarah's deepest fears, but the spirits of past guardians whispered encouragement through the totem. She was not alone. She carried the strength and wisdom of everyone who had ever stood in her position. Above ground, the confrontation was escalating. Emily's voice reached Sarah through the spiritual connection maintained by the copper cuff. "Sarah, they're surrounding the tree. Mayor Keen is demanding we tell them where you went." Father Miguel's calmer tones followed. "The townspeople are showing signs of increasing agitation. Whatever influence is affecting them, it's getting stronger." Sarah realized that the entity was drawing power from the corrupted residents above, using their spiritual energy to fuel its final escape attempt. She had to move quickly before it accumulated enough strength to break its bindings entirely. The seventh crystal pulsed with increasing urgency as Sarah drew closer, its light revealing the true nature of the entity's cage. The binding wasn't just made of physical materials. It was woven from the sacrifices of hundreds of guardians over countless generations. Each bar of light represented a life given freely to protect the world above. "Your grandfather's essence is here," the entity said with cruel satisfaction. "Running deer's spirit, bound into the very fabric of my prison. All of them chose slavery to keep me contained. Is that really the fate you want for yourself?" But as Sarah reached for the crystal, she understood the truth that the entity was trying to hide. The past guardians weren't enslaved. They were transformed, their consciousness woven into something larger and more purposeful than individual existence. They had become part of the protective force itself, eternal sentinels watching over the world they had died to defend. The moment her fingers touched the seventh crystal, the chamber exploded into chaos. The entity made its final, desperate attempt to break free, its form expanding against the weakening cage as centuries of patient planning came to fruition. Above ground, every corrupted person in Pine Ridge cried out in unison as the entity drew upon their life force. Trees began to wither and die throughout the valley as the creature's hunger reached beyond all previous limits. Sarah gripped the ancestor totem and began to climb back toward the surface, the complete crystal necklace blazing around her throat. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the fate of not just Pine Ridge, but the entire region hung in the balance. The Guardian's ultimate test had arrived. Sarah emerged from the earth to find the clearing in chaos. The corrupted townspeople had formed a hostile circle around the Guardian tree, their faces twisted with unnatural hatred as Mayor Keen directed them to tear down anything that might be protecting Sarah's dangerous activities. But their aggression faltered when Sarah appeared with the complete crystal necklace blazing around her throat and the ancestor totem radiating power in her hands. The supernatural storm that followed made the earlier weather seem like a gentle breeze. Lightning cracked across a sky that had been clear moments before, while winds howled through the forest with enough force to bend the massive surrounding trees. But the guardian tree remained perfectly still, as if it existed in a pocket of absolute calm. That calm shattered when the entity partially broke free. The tree's trunk began to split with sounds like gunshots, bark peeling away in massive chunks as something dark and hungry pressed outward from within. Through the widening cracks, tendrils of pure shadow emerged, reaching toward the terrified townspeople with obvious intent. "Now you see the truth." Mayor Keene screamed over the supernatural wind, but her voice carried harmonics that belonged to the entity itself. "This is what your precious tree lady has unleashed on our community." Sarah raised the ancestor totem and began the binding ritual, her voice carrying words in a language she had never learned but somehow knew by heart. The 7 crystals responded to her call, their individual lights merging into a protective barrier that held the entity's reaching shadows at bay. But the creature was far stronger than she had anticipated. It had been feeding on Pine Ridge's spiritual corruption for months, growing beyond the power levels that the original bindings had been designed to contain. Each word of the ritual required tremendous effort, as if she were trying to hold back an avalanche with her bare hands. The spirit blade materialized as the ritual reached its first crescendo, forming from the combined power of all the artifacts Sarah had gathered. The wooden heart, the bone flute, the copper cuff, the crystal necklace, the memory stone, and the ancestor totem. All of them dissolved into pure energy and reformed as a weapon that existed as much in the spiritual realm as the physical. The blade was beautiful and terrible, its edge gleaming with light that made the entity's shadows recoil. But wielding it required Sarah to step beyond the boundaries of normal human existence, to accept transformation into something that could stand against ancient evil. "You cannot stop me," the entity roared, its form now half emerged from the splitting tree. "I have claimed too many of your people. Their corruption anchors me to this realm." Sarah looked at the circle of townspeople and saw the truth of the creature's words. Dark tendrils connected the entity to each corrupted person, drawing power from their life force while poisoning their thoughts and emotions. As long as those connections remained, the entity could continue to grow stronger. The spirit blade hummed with potential as Sarah raised it toward the nearest tendril. But cutting those connections would require her to enter the spiritual realm completely, to fight the entity on its own terms, where physical laws held no meaning. Emily's voice reached her through the chaos. "Sarah! The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Whatever you're doing, the whole valley is responding." Father Miguel appeared at Sarah's side, his face grim with determination. "I can feel the evil radiating from that thing. Tell me how to help." "Protect the binding circle," Sarah replied, her voice already taking on otherworldly qualities as the transformation accelerated. "No matter what happens to me, don't let anyone interfere with the ritual." She stepped forward and pressed the spirit blade against the first shadow. Tendril reality exploded. Sarah found herself pulled into the spiritual realm, where the true battle would be fought. The clearing disappeared, replaced by a landscape of pure thought and emotion, where the entity appeared in its full magnificence. It was vast beyond comprehension, a creature of hunger and corruption that had existed since before human civilization began. But Sarah was no longer merely human either. The Guardian transformation was complete. Her consciousness expanded to encompass the spiritual ecosystem of the entire mountain. She could feel every tree, every stream, every living thing that called this place home. All of them were depending on her to succeed. The entity struck first, sending waves of despair and hopelessness that would have shattered an ordinary mind. But Sarah deflected them with the spirit blade, its light cutting through the attack like dawn, breaking over a dark landscape. "You are strong," the entity admitted, circling her with predatory grace. "Stronger than your ancestors. But strength alone will not save your precious town. Look at what I have accomplished while you gathered your little trinkets." The spiritual realm showed Sarah the true extent of the corruption. Not just Pine Ridge, but communities throughout the region showed signs of the entity's influence. It had been building a network of control for decades, preparing for the day when it would break free to claim the entire mountain range as its domain. Even if you bind me again, the entity continued, the corruption will remain. Your people will continue to carry my poison, passing it to their children and their children's children. I will win eventually, if not today, then tomorrow or next year or next century. Sarah raised the spirit blade, its light revealing the truth behind the entity's boasts. The corruption could be cleansed, but only through a sacrifice that would make the binding permanent rather than temporary. Back in the physical realm, Emily and Father Miguel watched in amazement as Sarah's form began to glow with the same light as the spirit blade. She was becoming translucent, her human body serving as a conduit for spiritual forces that were reshaping reality around the guardian tree. The corrupted townspeople had stopped their aggressive advance, confusion replacing hatred on their faces as the entity's hold on them weakened. Mayor Keene fell to her knees, clutching her head as two voices, her own and the creature's, battled for control of her consciousness. What's happening to her? Emily whispered, her scientific instruments completely unable to process the readings they were detecting. She's becoming something more than human, Father Miguel replied, his priest's training helping him recognize the signs of divine transformation. She's accepting the ultimate guardian sacrifice. In the spiritual realm, Sarah faced the entity's final desperate assault. It threw everything it had at her. Centuries of accumulated hatred, the combined despair of everyone it had ever corrupted, the crushing weight of cosmic indifference to human suffering. But for each attack, Sarah found strength in the connections that bound her to the living world. Every person she had ever cared about, every tree she had watched grow, every moment of beauty she had witnessed in 30 years of mountain vigils, all of it flowed through her, transforming pain into purpose. You would sacrifice everything for these insignificant mortals. The entity snarled, its form beginning to contract as Sarah's light pressed against it. They will forget you within a generation. Your sacrifice will be meaningless. My sacrifice will be complete, Sarah replied, raising the spirit blade for the final strike. And that's what makes it powerful. The blade pierced the entity's core, sending shockwaves through both the spiritual and physical realms. In the clearing, the guardian tree's trunk began to heal itself, bark flowing like water to seal the cracks that had threatened to release ancient evil. The entity's scream of rage and defeat echoed across dimensions as it was pulled back into its prison. But Sarah knew this victory was only the beginning. To make the binding permanent, to ensure that the entity could never again threaten the world she loved, she would have to give more than her human life. She would have to become part of the guardian tree itself, joining the spirits of all who had served before her in eternal vigilance. As the spirit blade completed its work, Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to merge with the ancient oak's spiritual essence. It was not death, it was transformation into something larger and more enduring than any individual existence. The battle was won, but the greatest sacrifice was yet to come. The guardian sacrifice began as Sarah fully understood what the ritual demanded. To make the binding permanent, to ensure that the entity could never again threaten the mountain or its people, she would have to weave her own life force into the spiritual cage that held the creature. It was not enough to simply repair the existing bindings. They had to be fundamentally strengthened with fresh guardian power. "I accept," Sarah whispered, her words carrying across both the physical and spiritual realms. "I accept the transformation." The moment she spoke those words, golden light began to flow from her body toward the guardian tree. But this wasn't death, as humans understood it. It was a conscious choice to expand beyond individual existence, to become part of something eternal and protective. Running Deer's spirit appeared beside her, no longer as a vision, but as a tangible presence in the space between worlds. "Welcome, granddaughter, to the circle of eternal guardians. You will not be alone in your watch." The entity made one final desperate attempt to corrupt the ritual. It reached out with the last of its failing strength, trying to twist Sarah's sacrifice into something that would serve its own purposes. "Join with me instead," it whispered seductively. "Together we could rule this realm, remake it according to our will." But Sarah's choice had already been made. Her sacrifice was freely given, powered by love rather than hatred, protection rather than domination. The entity's corruption could not touch something so pure in its intent. As Sarah's human form began to fade, Mayor Keen suddenly cried out in the physical realm. The entity's hold on her snapped like a breaking chain, and Patricia Keen, the real Patricia Keen, looked around the clearing with horror and confusion. "What am I doing here?" she gasped, staring at the circle of townspeople who were similarly shaking off supernatural influence. "I remember!" Voices in my head telling me to hurt Sarah, but they weren't my thoughts. One by one, the corrupted residents of Pine Ridge awakened from their supernatural nightmare. Tom Hartwell was the first to understand what had happened, his weathered face showing profound regret as he approached the glowing guardian tree. "Sarah," he called softly. "Are you still in there?" Sarah's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, warm with affection, but carrying harmonics that spoke of transformation beyond human limits. "I'm here, Tom. I'm more here than I've ever been." Emily's scientific instruments were detecting readings that redefined her understanding of physics. "The electromagnetic patterns have stabilized," she reported in wonder. "But they're not just stable, they're actively protective. It's as if the entire valley is shielded by some kind of beneficial field." Father Miguel knelt beside the tree, his priest's heart recognizing the sacred nature of what had occurred. "You've become something like a saint," he murmured. "A guardian angel for this entire region." The entity, now securely bound within layers of spiritual protection that included Sarah's willing sacrifice, made one last attempt at defiance. "This is not over," it raged. "Someday, somehow, I will find a way to freedom." "No," Sarah's transformed voice replied with absolute certainty. "This is over. Your power was always based on corruption, on taking what was not freely given. My sacrifice was a gift, and gifts create bonds that cannot be broken by force or deception." The supernatural storm that had raged around the clearing began to subside, replaced by a profound peace that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. Stars appeared in the clearing sky with unusual brightness, as if the spiritual cleansing had removed more than just supernatural threats. Mayor Keen approached Emily and Father Miguel with tears streaming down her face. "I did terrible things while that creature was in my head. I said horrible things about Sarah, tried to turn the whole town against her. How can I ever make amends?" "By remembering," Father Miguel replied gently. "By making sure Pine Ridge never forgets what Sarah Bennett sacrificed to protect us all." As dawn approached, the townspeople began to disperse, each carrying the memory of supernatural horror and redemption that would reshape how they understood their community and its protector. But Emily and Father Miguel remained, drawn by the sense that Sarah's story wasn't quite finished. "Will we still be able to talk with you?" Emily asked the tree. "When you need guidance, I'll be here," Sarah's presence replied. "Not just me, all the guardians who came before. We form an unbroken chain of protection that stretches back to the beginning of human civilization." The guardian tree stood transformed, its trunk now showing veins of golden light that pulsed with gentle rhythm. The supernatural bulge that had marked the entity's presence was gone, replaced by bark that gleamed with inner radiance. Sarah Bennett had completed her transformation from human guardian to spiritual protector, joining the eternal watch that kept ancient evils bound and communities safe. Her sacrifice had not ended her existence. It had expanded it beyond all previous limits. The final battle was won, but Sarah's true service was just beginning. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Pine Ridge had settled into a new kind of normal. The town carried itself differently now, with the quiet confidence of a community that had faced supernatural horror and emerged protected by sacrifice they could never fully repay. The guardian tree stood magnificent in its clearing, no longer swollen with imprisoned evil, but radiant with protective power. Visitors came regularly now, some drawn by stories of the Pine Ridge miracle, others simply feeling called to a place where spiritual forces had touched the physical world in ways that couldn't be explained but could definitely be felt. Dr. Emily Chen had established a permanent research station near the tree, though her work had evolved far beyond conventional geology. The readings she collected defied traditional scientific explanation, but they painted a clear picture of a natural system that was actively protecting the entire valley from threats, both seen and unseen. The electromagnetic field extends for roughly 50 miles in all directions, Emily explained to a visiting professor from the University of Montana. But it's not just electromagnetic. There are patterns here that suggest consciousness, intention, purposeful activity that maintains environmental balance. The New Guardian's journal had appeared in Sarah's old cabin exactly 1 week after her transformation, materializing on her kitchen table as if it had always been there. Dorothy Walsh had found it while helping to organize Sarah's papers for the Historical Society, and the discovery had left her speechless with wonder. The journal wrote itself, pages filling with Sarah's observations about the spiritual ecosystem she now helped to maintain. But more than that, it contained practical guidance for future guardians, instructions for recognizing and responding to supernatural threats, and wisdom accumulated from centuries of protectors who had served before. Father Miguel had taken on the responsibility of maintaining Sarah's cabin as a kind of shrine, ensuring that the guardian knowledge would be preserved for whoever might need it in years to come. The parish had initially questioned his decision to honor what some considered pagan practices, but the undeniable peace that had settled over Pine Ridge after Sarah's sacrifice made it difficult to argue with results. She gave her life to protect us. Father Miguel had explained to his bishop, that kind of selfless love is sacred, regardless of the specific traditions that shaped it. If that's not worthy of our respect and remembrance, then what is? Tom Hartwell's general store had become an unofficial information center for people seeking to understand what had happened in Pine Ridge. Tom answered questions with the same patient good humor he'd always shown. But his descriptions of Sarah Bennett carried a reverence that hadn't been there before. She was always different, he would tell visitors. Always watching, always paying attention to things the rest of us missed. Turns out she was protecting us the whole time. And we never even knew it. Mayor Patricia Keene had resigned from office immediately after recovering from the entity's influence, unable to bear the weight of actions she'd taken while corrupted. But she'd thrown herself into community service with the dedication of someone seeking redemption, establishing programs to preserve local history and protect the mountain environment that Sarah had died to defend. The town council had unanimously voted to designate the Guardian Tree and its clearing as a protected wilderness area, ensuring that Sarah's sacrifice would never be threatened by development or commercialization. A simple bronze plaque marked the trailhead reading, "In memory of Sarah Bennett, who watched faithfully and sacrificed completely." But those who knew the truth understood that Sarah wasn't really gone. Her presence could be felt throughout the valley, in the unusual clarity of the stream water, in the remarkable health of the forest, in the sense of safety that had settled over Pine Ridge like a protective blanket. Children who had never known Sarah in life would sometimes point toward the tree and ask their parents about the lady made of light they could see standing beneath its branches. Adults who ventured into the clearing during times of personal crisis often reported hearing gentle voices offering comfort and guidance. Emily documented dozens of such encounters, building a database of evidence that consciousness could survive beyond physical death when it was anchored to something larger than individual existence. Her research attracted attention from scientists around the world, though many remained skeptical of conclusions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. On the first anniversary of Sarah's transformation, Pine Ridge held a celebration that was part memorial service, a part harvest festival, and part spiritual gathering. People came from throughout the region to honor the woman who had given everything to protect them from threats they would never fully understand. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and golds, Emily and Father Miguel stood together in the clearing where it all began. The guardian tree hummed with gentle power, its golden veins pulsing in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. "Do you think she's happy?" Emily asked quietly. The answer came not in words, but in a feeling, a sense of profound peace and purpose that settled over the clearing like a benediction. Sarah Bennett had found her calling at last, joining the eternal watch that kept darkness at bay and communities safe. Running Deer's spirit appeared beside the tree, no longer alone but accompanied by Sarah's radiant presence. Together, they stood guard over the mountain and its people, continuing a tradition as old as human civilization itself. The guardian's sacrifice was complete, but her protection would endure forever. In the end, love had proven stronger than hunger, service more powerful than corruption, and willing sacrifice the foundation upon which true security was built. Pine Ridge slept peacefully under the watchful eyes of its eternal protectors, and the ancient evil that had once threatened to consume everything remained safely bound beneath the roots of the mountain. Sarah Bennett's 30-year vigil had become an eternal watch, ensuring that some things would always be held sacred, always be defended, always be preserved for those who came after. The story was complete, but the protection would never end.